Remember those forgotten 10-minute dinners you could only find in old cookbooks? They were the lifesavers for busy families when every minute and every dollar counted. How did we lose meals that simple and that important? Creamed corn and hot dog skillet was one of those meals that showed up when time was short and the cupboards looked bare. You sliced up those hot dogs, tossed them in a skillet, and let them simmer in a can of creamed corn until everything bubbled together. It sounds a little ridiculous now, but back then, it was comfort food at its most practical. This was not a recipe out of some fancy magazine. It came straight from the faded pages of those old spiral-bound cookbooks that every kitchen drawer seemed to have. Families on tight budgets loved it because it made use of pantry staples, and somehow, that sweet corn and salty hot dog combination worked. You could dress it up with black pepper or a little hot sauce, but most folks kept it plain. After a long day, this dinner showed up in 10 minutes flat, filling your belly even if your wallet felt empty. Funny how those quick meals stick with you long after the hard times pass. Salmon and canned pea toasts were how you made pantry food look halfway fancy when the clock and your energy ran out. You took canned salmon, mashed it with mayonnaise, stirred in some peas, and spread it thick over hot toast. That was dinner. It sounds simple now, but when fresh meat was scarce or paychecks were tight, this was the kind of meal that kept families going. The old cookbooks were filled with little tricks like this, ways to stretch canned goods into something that almost felt special. Salmon from a can never fooled anyone, but the crunch of toast and the soft peas made it oddly satisfying. You might even see a sprinkle of pepper or a squeeze of lemon if someone was feeling bold. It came together fast, filled you up, and for those 10 minutes in the kitchen, it made you feel like you still had control over dinner. Sometimes that is all anyone needed. Minute rice with canned chili and cheese was the dinner of champions. If your definition of champion was someone who worked 12 hours and still had to put food on the table. That old minute rice box was a lifeline back then, cooking up fluffy in just a few minutes. You dumped canned chili right over the top, shredded some cheddar if you had it, and dinner was done. Nobody expected it to be gourmet, but it filled you up, stuck to your ribs, and made sure you were ready for the next shift, the next chore, the next whatever life threw at you. The cookbooks from those days leaned hard on pantry meals like this because they worked. They were honest, quick dinners that kept you standing, even when life tried to knock you down. And hey, melted cheese makes everything better. Fried bologna and mashed potato bowls were what happened when leftovers met desperation, in the best way. Bologna was cheap, salty, and easy to fry up in a hot pan until the edges curled just right and got that crispy golden ring. Leftover mashed potatoes were scooped into a bowl, topped with the hot bologna, and if you were lucky, drowned in ketchup, gravy, or whatever sauce was hiding in the fridge. It was not about being fancy. This was survival food pulled straight from those old creased cookbooks every family tucked away in the kitchen drawer, the ones stained with coffee rings and margarine smudges. No one expected it to be restaurant-worthy, but that salty bite of bologna with creamy potatoes stuck to your ribs after a long, hard day. It filled you up fast and made use of whatever scraps were left from last night's dinner. When you only had 10 minutes and not a penny to spare, this meal was a lifesaver. Cottage cheese and pineapple plates were the go-to for a light summer dinner when turning on the stove felt like punishment. You would scoop a generous mound of cottage cheese onto your plate, plop some pineapple rings or chunks right alongside, and maybe toss in a saltine cracker or two if you were feeling fancy. That was dinner. It sounds a little strange now, but back then it was right there in every old cookbook promising quick, budget-friendly meals that helped stretch the pantry and beat the heat. It was cold, creamy, and sweet. The kind of meal that made sure you stayed full without sweating over a hot skillet. For families trying to get by on tight paychecks, it was a lifesaver. And somehow, that odd combination of tangy cottage cheese and syrupy pineapple rings actually worked. It might not win any culinary awards today, but during those lean years, it was exactly the kind of practical magic you needed. Spam and egg scramble was one of those 10-minute dinners that showed up again and again when times got lean. You diced up a can of Spam, fried it in a hot skillet until the edges curled and crisped, then scrambled in a few eggs with onions if they were around. It all came together fast, filled your plate, and made sure nobody went to bed hungry. Spam was a pantry staple for a reason. Cheap, shelf-stable, and surprisingly versatile. The old cookbooks were full of ways to stretch it into something that felt like a real meal. Toss in eggs, and suddenly, dinner looked good enough to serve without apology. It was salty, hearty, and loaded with that familiar taste of making do with what you had. Families leaned on quick meals like this because they worked. 10 minutes on the stove, a hot plate in front of everyone, and dinner was done. No one claimed it was fancy, but when your pantry was empty and the paycheck still days away, it tasted like a small victory. Funny how those simple, practical meals stuck with us. They filled the gaps and filled us up. Cracker-crusted sardine patties were about as close to seafood night as most working families ever got when money was tight. You would mash up a can of sardines, crush some saltine crackers, and mix the two until it held together just enough to form a patty. That patty went straight into a hot skillet with a little oil, frying up crisp on the outside and soft in the middle. It was not a fancy fish fillet from the market, but it was hot, salty, and filled your stomach fast. These little patties showed up all over those old cookbook pages from the 1930s to the 1970s because they were reliable, cheap, and fast. Most families topped them with mustard or a spoonful of relish, whatever scraps were left in the icebox. Nobody expected restaurant fare. These were survival meals dressed up to look halfway decent. Sardines were affordable, packed with protein, and did not spoil in the cupboard, which made them a go-to when you had to feed everyone with pennies to your name. One-pot macaroni and tomatoes was probably the easiest dinner anyone could pull together when the cupboards were running low. You boiled up elbow macaroni, dumped in a can of stewed tomatoes, added a pat of butter if you could spare it, and that was it. It came straight from those old Depression-era cookbooks, the ones stained with years of spills and handwritten notes. This was survival food, plain and simple, but it never pretended to be more. The tomatoes gave just enough sweetness to balance the salty pasta water, and that sprinkle of black pepper over the top made it feel complete. Families leaned on meals like this because they stretched what little you had, and you could serve every last person at the table without wondering how you were going to afford groceries next week. It was quick, hot, and filled you up when you needed it most. The old cookbooks called it economical, but for most folks, it was just Tuesday night. Funny how something so simple stuck around for generations. Baked bean and Frankfurter cups were one of those dinners that showed up when parents needed something fast, cheap, and guaranteed to make the kids smile. You sliced up hot dogs, stirred them into a bubbling pot of canned baked beans, and let the whole thing simmer together until it smelled good enough to fool everyone into thinking dinner took effort. You could scoop it into bowls or coffee mugs, hand everyone a spoon, and dinner was done before anyone had the chance to complain. This recipe came straight from those old community cookbooks and church bulletins, the ones filled with quick fixes and budget meals for families running on empty. It was salty, sweet, and hearty enough to stick to your ribs after a long day of work or school. Those beans and franks might not have been gourmet, but they filled the kitchen with warmth, and for 10 minutes of effort, that was a win. You would see this recipe clipped onto fridge doors or scribbled on index cards, passed down because it worked. It was comforting, cheap, and faster than takeout. A classic for busy homes making the best of what the pantry had left. Cheddar egg toast with pickle spears was proof that even with the bare minimum in your kitchen, you could still whip up a dinner that hit all the right notes. You started with plain sliced bread, cracked an egg over the top, sprinkled shredded cheddar cheese across the whole thing, and slid it under the broiler until the edges turned crisp and the cheese bubbled up. Add a pickle spear on the side, the sharper and brinnier, the better, and suddenly dinner felt just a little more put together. This was the kind of meal that showed up in all those old spiral-bound cookbooks from the 1930s through the 70s. Fast, affordable, and surprisingly filling, it kept people going through lean years when even simple groceries felt like luxuries. Cheese, eggs, and bread might have been basic pantry staples, but when you combined them like this, it felt special enough to count. Families leaned on recipes like this because they worked, You could have dinner ready in under 10 minutes, and everyone stayed full. Those little meals did not need much, just heat, a little creativity, and whatever odds and ends you had lying around. Somehow, that was always enough. Campbell's mushroom soup over toast was one of those forgotten Depression-era dinners that somehow made a quiet comeback in old cookbooks from the 1940s through the 70s. It was as simple as it sounds, but it filled your belly fast. You opened a can of creamy mushroom soup, heated it up in a pot, and spooned it over slices of buttered toast. That was dinner. It did not pretend to be anything fancy, but when the cupboards were almost empty and the clock was ticking, it got the job done. Families leaned on meals like this when money was tight and time was short. It turned one can of soup into a warm, filling meal that stretched across the table. Maybe you sprinkled some black pepper on top, maybe a little dried parsley, but most folks kept it plain. It soaked into the bread, made the whole kitchen smell like home, and filled you up after a long day. Those old cookbooks were full of meals like this, simple recipes that felt comforting without much effort. Funny how the humblest dinners tend to stick around the longest, even when everything else changes. Sauteed canned corn and scrambled eggs was the kind of meal you whipped up when the pantry looked bare, but you still wanted dinner to taste halfway decent. It came together in 10 minutes flat. You drained a can of sweet corn, tossed it in a skillet with butter, and let it sizzle until the kernels softened and browned just a little around the edges. Then you cracked in a few eggs, scrambled them together, and dinner was done before anyone could ask what was cooking. Old cookbooks loved recipes like this because they were fast, cheap, and practical. You could eat it plain or sprinkle on some salt and pepper to dress it up. The sweetness of the corn with the soft, buttery eggs made a surprisingly good combination. It was filling enough to pass for dinner, but easy enough to feel like you barely lifted a finger. These were the meals that stretched the grocery budget, kept families full, and made sure nobody went to bed hungry. It might not have been fancy, but back then, fancy was never the goal. Getting by was. Canned chicken hash was how you made a hot, filling dinner happen when all you had was pantry scraps and a few minutes to spare. You popped open a can of shredded chicken, fried it in a skillet with some chopped onions, and tossed in leftover mashed potatoes or canned potatoes if you had them. Everything crisped up around the edges, browned in the pan, and came together into something that looked decent and filled your stomach fast. Old cookbooks leaned hard on meals like this because they were cheap, quick, and made sure nothing went to waste. Chicken hash might not sound glamorous, but in homes where leftovers were gold, it was a lifesaver. You could top it with a fried egg or spoon a little gravy over it if you were lucky, but most folks ate it just as it was, hot, salty, and good enough to count. This was dinner that made the best of what you had, and back in those days, that meant everything. Funny how meals like this stuck around even when fancier options showed up. Sometimes the fast, familiar ones were the best. Ketchup fried rice was one of those odd shortcut dinners that turned pantry scraps into something hot and surprisingly satisfying. You started with cold leftover rice, tossed it in a hot skillet with chopped onions, and stirred in a few big spoonfuls of ketchup. That was it. If you had leftover meat like ham or chicken, you diced it up and threw it in too. It was tangy, salty, a little sweet, and filled you up fast when there was not much else in the fridge. This recipe showed up in old cookbooks from the 1950s through the 70s, a quirky little trick that stretched leftovers and made dinner happen in 10 minutes flat. It was not fancy, but it worked, especially for families juggling tight paychecks and even tighter grocery lists. You might not see ketchup fried rice on menus today, but back then, it was a practical fix for busy nights and bare pantries. It turned scraps into something warm, filling, and oddly comforting. Funny how the strangest combinations sometimes stick with us the longest. American chop suey with elbows and tomato sauce was how families made a one-pan dinner stretch across the whole table without breaking the bank. It started with ground beef browned in a skillet, elbow macaroni tossed right in, and a jar of tomato sauce poured over the top. Everything simmered together until the pasta was tender, the beef was cooked through, and the sauce thickened up. It took less than 10 minutes to pull together, and nobody left the table hungry. This meal came straight from the old cookbooks tucked away in kitchen drawers, the ones full of budget tricks and fast dinners for busy families. American chop suey was not fancy, but it was dependable, hot, and filling. The elbows caught just enough sauce, the beef added protein, and the whole thing fed a crowd without much effort. Families leaned on meals like this because they worked. They were fast, affordable, and made sure dinner still happened even when paychecks ran short. You could dress it up with a little cheese or keep it plain, but either way, it hit the spot. Funny how the simplest meals stick around the longest. Pimento cheese sandwich melts were one of those quick, bold dinners that came straight from old cookbooks packed with practical, no-nonsense recipes. You took slices of bread, spread them thick with creamy, tangy pimento cheese, and grilled them in a skillet until the outside was golden and crisp. It was not just a sandwich. It was a fast, hot meal with big flavor that came together in 10 minutes or less. Pimento cheese was everywhere back then, especially in southern kitchens, but families all over used it to stretch groceries and add some punch to an otherwise plain dinner. You could eat the melt with pickles on the side or a handful of chips if you had them, but most folks kept it simple. The creamy cheese, the sharp bite of pimentos, the crunchy bread, it all worked together to make a dinner that felt filling without taking much effort. These meals showed up again and again in faded cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards because they did exactly what they needed to: feed everyone fast. Funny how the boldest flavors came from the simplest tricks. Vienna sausage omelet rolls were the quick, clever way families turned pantry food into dinner when the fridge looked bare. You sliced up those little Vienna sausages, tossed them into a hot skillet, and poured whisked eggs right over the top. As the eggs set, you rolled them up like a little omelet wrap, cut it in half if you wanted, and dinner was ready before anyone had time to ask what was cooking. Old cookbooks were filled with recipes like this, fast meals that used up canned staples and turned them into something hot, salty, and filling. You could spoon a little relish on top, serve it with crackers, or keep it plain, but no matter how you fixed it, it hit the spot. Vienna sausages were cheap, easy to store, and lasted forever in the pantry, which made them a go-to when fresh meat was hard to come by. These omelet rolls were not fancy, but they filled you up and got dinner done without much effort. Meals like this stuck around because they worked. They made the most of what little you had, and sometimes that was more than enough. Sardines on rye with onion and mustard was the kind of dinner that proved you could survive on pantry food and still eat something with bite. You opened a can of sardines, layered them cold onto slices of rye bread, and topped the whole thing with sliced onion and spicy mustard. That was dinner. It was salty, briny, sharp, and came together in minutes without a stove or oven in sight. This meal showed up in old cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards for one reason: it worked. Sardines were cheap, packed with protein, and lasted forever in the cupboard. Rye bread had enough bite to hold its own, and the mustard gave everything a sharp kick that kept it from feeling too plain. You ate it open-faced, with a fork and knife if you felt proper, or just with your hands when time was short. It was quick, practical, and oddly satisfying even when the grocery budget was running on empty. Funny how the simplest pantry meals stuck with us, long after times got easier. Corned beef hash from the can was one of those pantry miracles that turned a tin of meat and potatoes into a hot, filling dinner without much fuss. You sliced open the can, dumped the hash into a hot skillet, and let it crisp up around the edges until it was golden and ready to eat. You could fry an egg on top if you had one, but even plain, it did the job. This meal came straight from those old cookbooks that knew exactly how to stretch groceries and fill a plate fast. Corned beef hash was salty, hearty, and packed enough flavor to make up for how simple it was. It fed families during tight times, filled lunch boxes, and showed up on the table when there was not much else to work with. It might not have been fancy, but it was practical. And back then, practical meals were king. These dinners got everyone fed in under 10 minutes, with nothing wasted and no one left hungry. Funny how even canned food like this turned into something that stuck around in people's memories. Mayo and peanut butter sandwiches with lettuce were one of those strange little meals that somehow showed up again and again in old cookbooks, no matter how odd they sounded. You spread peanut butter on one slice of soft white bread, mayonnaise on the other, tucked in a crisp piece of iceberg lettuce, and slapped the whole thing together. That was dinner. It sounds like a dare now, but back then it was quick, filling, and surprisingly popular when groceries ran low and people had to make the best of whatever was in the pantry. The peanut butter gave it richness, the mayo added tang, and the lettuce brought crunch to pull it all together. It was salty, creamy, a little sweet, and ready in under 5 minutes. Families leaned on meals like this because they stretched simple ingredients, filled you up, and kept dinner from feeling impossible when paychecks were short. It might not have been fancy, but it worked. And funny enough, folks who grew up with this odd little sandwich still remember the taste. Sometimes getting by meant getting creative. Fried canned spaghetti and cheese was the dinner you threw together when there was not much left in the fridge and your stomach was growling. You would open up a can of leftover spaghetti, sauce and all, and toss it straight into a hot skillet. As it fried, the sauce thickened, the noodles crisped up around the edges, and everything smelled just good enough to pass for a proper meal. Then you sprinkled shredded cheese over the top, let it melt, and scraped it onto a plate. That was dinner. It came from old cookbooks full of clever ways to stretch leftovers and make canned food feel less like survival and more like comfort. It was salty, cheesy, crispy in the right places, and ready in under 10 minutes. Most folks ate it standing by the stove or while leaning over the kitchen table because that is how those quick meals always went. It was simple, but it filled you up. Funny how a can of spaghetti and some cheese could turn into something worth remembering. Quick tomato egg drop soup was a fast, practical dinner that showed up in old cookbooks for families juggling tight grocery budgets and tighter schedules. You started with hot broth, usually whatever bouillon cube or soup base you had in the cupboard. Then you poured in canned tomatoes and stirred everything together until it simmered. The final touch was whisked eggs, slowly dripped in as you stirred, turning into silky ribbons in the hot broth. It looked a little fancier than it was, but this meal was all about speed and making the best of what you had. The tomatoes added sweetness, the broth made it filling, and the eggs gave enough protein to keep everyone going. It came together in less than 10 minutes and cost next to nothing, which is exactly why old cookbooks loved it. It was warm, fast, and comforting without much effort. Families leaned on meals like this because they filled bellies and stretched paychecks at the same time. Funny how those quick little soup tricks turned into classics that still stick with people. Shredded lettuce and tuna salad wraps were one of those dinners that showed up when the heat made cooking feel impossible. You scooped canned tuna salad straight into crunchy iceberg lettuce leaves, added a few slices of pickle for good measure, and called it dinner. It was cold, crisp, and came together in under 10 minutes with barely any cleanup. These wraps showed up in old cookbooks for a reason. They were cheap, fast, and refreshing when summer turned the kitchen into an oven. You could dress them up with a little extra mayo or mustard, but most folks kept it plain. The lettuce added crunch, the tuna filled you up, and the whole thing made dinner happen without turning on the stove. It was practical, quick, and surprisingly satisfying when the weather left you with no energy to cook. These dinners were the kind that helped families survive hot nights and long days when the grocery list felt short and the pantry felt even shorter. Funny how the simplest meals are the ones we remember longest. Potted meat spread on Ritz crackers was one of those pantry dinners that proved fast, salty, and filling could all happen in under 10 minutes. You popped open a can of potted meat, scooped it straight onto Ritz crackers, and that was dinner. It could be served cold, right from the can, or warmed up if you wanted to make it feel a little fancier. But most folks just ate it plain. The creamy, salty spread paired with buttery crackers was oddly comforting, especially on busy nights or after long days when there was no time or energy to cook. Old cookbooks were packed with tricks like this, budget meals that filled you up with nothing but pantry staples and some creativity. Potted meat might not sound glamorous now, but it lasted forever in the cupboard and made dinner happen when groceries ran low. These little cracker meals were fast, filling, and made the best of tight times. Funny how a can of mystery meat and a box of crackers could still count as dinner and leave you full. Hard-boiled egg and buttered saltine platters were how families turned simple fridge staples into a protein-packed dinner when groceries ran thin. You boiled a few eggs, sliced them up, and laid them out over a plate of buttered saltine crackers. That was dinner. It sounds plain, but when times were tight and there was no time to cook, it filled you up fast. The saltines added crunch, the butter gave richness, and the eggs brought protein that kept you going. This little meal showed up in old cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards because it was practical, affordable, and came together with what most people already had on hand. You could add black pepper or a little hot sauce if you wanted to dress it up, but most folks kept it plain. These were the kinds of dinners that got families through lean times, stretching groceries and keeping bellies full with almost no effort. Funny how a few crackers and eggs could feel like enough when the clock was ticking and the cupboards looked bare. Quick potato flake pancakes were one of those practical budget dinners born from the back of old pantry shelves. You grabbed a box of instant potato flakes, mixed them with water and a little egg if you had it, then shaped the dough into small pancakes and fried them up in butter. That was dinner. It came together in 10 minutes flat and filled you up with simple, salty, crispy goodness. These pancakes were a staple of old cookbooks that loved pantry meals you could make fast with whatever was on hand. No peeling, no mashing, no waiting for potatoes to boil, just flakes, water, and a hot skillet. You could add herbs or cheese to dress them up, but most families kept it simple. They were crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and filled your plate without much effort. This was dinner that made the best of tight grocery budgets and busy nights. Funny how something as humble as potato flakes could feel like a proper meal when you needed it most. Leftover rice with creamed spinach was one of those pantry meals that turned odds and ends into something filling, warm, and fast. You scooped leftover rice into a skillet, stirred in canned creamed spinach, and added a splash of milk or cheese if you had any left. Everything cooked together until hot, and that was dinner. It was creamy, salty, and just filling enough to count when there was not much else in the cupboard. These little skillet meals showed up in old cookbooks because they stretched groceries, made dinner happen fast, and kept families full during lean times. You could eat it plain, add black pepper, or even crack an egg on top if you wanted to feel fancy, but most folks just scooped it onto a plate and called it a night. This meal did not take much: leftovers, canned greens, and a little creativity, and somehow it got everyone fed. Funny how these quick, practical dinners stick with you long after times get easier. Hot dog and Velveeta quesadillas were a dinner shortcut that showed up when there was no time and even less energy to cook. You sliced hot dogs, laid them into a tortilla with chunks of Velveeta cheese, folded it over, and tossed the whole thing in a hot skillet until the cheese melted and the tortilla crisped. That was dinner. It took less than 10 minutes, filled you up, and made the best of whatever was left in the fridge. Old cookbooks and family recipe boxes leaned on meals like this because they were fast, cheap, and comforting. The salty hot dogs, gooey cheese, and crispy tortilla made this simple dinner feel like more than the sum of its parts. You could dip it in ketchup, mustard, or just eat it plain, but either way, it was satisfying. Families on tight budgets and tight schedules loved meals like this. They stretched groceries, came together fast, and kept everyone full. Funny how a tortilla, some cheese, and a hot dog could feel like enough when the pantry looked bare. Cold beans and onion salad was a no-cook dinner pulled straight from the cupboard that showed up again and again during lean times. You opened a can of kidney beans, drained them, and tossed them with sliced onion, vinegar, salt, and pepper. That was dinner. It might not sound like much now, but when the summer heat made turning on the stove unbearable, it was a lifesaver. These little bean salads filled old cookbooks from the 1930s to the 70s because they were quick, cheap, and practical. The vinegar gave it tang, the onions added bite, and the beans packed enough protein to get you through the night. You served it cold, right from the fridge, and ate it with a fork straight from the bowl. It was filling, salty, and satisfying when groceries ran low and energy ran even lower. Families leaned on meals like this because they worked. They filled you up fast, cost next to nothing, and kept the kitchen cool. funny how the simplest pantry meals stick around longest. Boiled egg and sweet pickle sandwiches were the fast, quirky little dinner that came together in minutes when you needed to stretch groceries. You mashed up boiled eggs, mixed them with diced sweet pickles and mayonnaise, and spread the whole thing between slices of soft white bread. That was dinner. It sounds a little strange now, but it filled you up, stretched a carton of eggs, and cost next to nothing. These sandwiches showed up in old cookbooks from the 1940s through the 70s because they were practical, easy, and satisfying. The eggs added protein, the pickles gave sweetness and crunch, and the soft bread pulled it all together. You could eat it plain or toss in a little pepper if you wanted to dress it up, but most folks kept it simple. These were the dinners that filled plates fast, stretched budgets, and got families through tight times. Funny how the oddest little combinations stick with you long after the hard years pass. Few dishes command attention quite like a well-prepared crown roast. Traditionally served at homecoming dinners and holiday gatherings, it was the kind of dish that made guests stop and admire before the first bite. The ring of bone-in pork chops, arranged in a regal circle, was as much about presentation as it was about flavor. For families looking to impress without breaking the bank, the pork crown roast was a surprisingly economical choice. Pork was, and still is, one of the most affordable meats, and butchers often offered deals on bulk cuts. The apricot glaze, a key feature of this recipe, added just the right balance of sweetness and depth, while a bread-based stuffing packed the center for an even heartier meal. Preparing this dish took skill and patience. The roast had to be properly Frenched, tied, and slow-cooked to achieve that juicy, tender texture. But for many home cooks, the challenge was worth the reward. Unfortunately, as home butchering became a lost art and families shifted toward convenience meals, the crown roast started to disappear from dinner tables. Lentil soups were even more common in the medieval world. They would change a lot depending on the region, though. For example, in Europe's southern regions like Provence and Spain, lentils were not only used to feed humans, but also to feed animals. Lentil pottages were one of the most important meals for the church as well because when the fast would break, this was one of the few meals that could feed an entire group and still be very easy to prepare. Lentils would provide an incredible dose of protein, and it would need just water and a few other vegetables if you could spare them. Onions, leeks, and garlic, or just some savory or sage would work really well. In the Middle East and North Africa, lentil soups were something else entirely. Medieval Arab cookbooks like Anwa al-Saidala f Alwan al-Atima would feature all kinds of lentil recipes with an incredible amount of flavoring, seasonings, and spices to make it stand out from other dishes. It would be a lot more bombastic and flavorful than European versions of the same dish, and if looking at today's world is any example, I think it's historically accurate to say that they've always had us beat when it comes to working with legumes. Bread pudding with water sauce is about as simplistic as it comes. This is a dish that people didn't even really put any thought into. It was just a way for them to repurpose resources that were about to spoil and go to waste. This is really something you never want happening in the Depression because it was a sign that you were just not handling your pantry properly. Back then, people religiously followed a mindset of not wasting anything, even the grease and drippings from bacon, and you'll find a dish or two made out of that later on in this video too. Back to bread pudding with water sauce. So, you might have heard of bread pudding before, but what really is water sauce? I mean, it sounds like a bastardized version of sparkling water when you first hear it. It's actually just a modest attempt at making a thickened sauce out of just water, because most of the time people were not working with any kind of legitimate thickener or enough ingredients to make a proper sauce, so they had to settle for whatever they could come up with to make stale bread more refreshing. The bread pudding in question is essentially just stale, almost moldy bread soaked in sweetened water, and most of the time, the sweetening was with things like maple syrup. Even this is something people began to tap out of maple trees whenever they could because they couldn't spend the extra cents. Still, we have a lot more leverage nowadays, so you can probably actually make a decent bread pudding-based sauce dish with enough ingredients and guidance, but the next time you really need to finish some bread, you know what to make. Before plant-based eating became trendy, hearty vegetarian dishes like this one were a practical necessity. Creamy wild rice and mushroom casserole was a staple in Midwestern and Northern kitchens, especially during the colder months. Packed with earthy flavors and a rich, velvety texture, it was a comforting dish that felt just as satisfying as any meat-based meal. Wild rice, despite its name, isn't actually rice. It's a highly nutritious aquatic grain native to North America. Indigenous tribes harvested it for centuries, and by the mid-20th century, it had found its way into everyday cooking. Though slightly more expensive than white rice, its nutty flavor and chewy texture made it worth the price. Combined with mushrooms, one of the most affordable and widely available vegetables, this dish was both economical and deeply flavorful. A creamy sauce, often made with milk, butter, and a touch of sherry, tied everything together, creating a casserole that was rich yet wholesome. As convenience foods surged in popularity, canned cream of anything soup replaced homemade sauces, and wild rice was increasingly swapped for cheaper, quicker cooking grains. Over time, this once-loved casserole became a relic of an era when scratch cooking was the norm. In medieval Europe, fish and root vegetables were the most common thing for a majority of the population. Most of them could not afford to sustainably get meat every single time they went out for grocery shopping. It was also something that was really preferred by religious followers of the church, although I can't really imagine a specific reason why. For root vegetables, I can see veganism being something a well-intending church appreciates, but then why the meat? If there are any history buffs in the comments, let us know. Now, the dish itself would change a lot. This would heavily depend on the kind of climate and geography you were working with. Coastal regions, like along the North Sea or the Baltic, for example, had a dense ecosystem of marine life. They had herring, whiting, haddock and cod, salmon or crabs, and people would often just work with whatever the catch of the day was. These fish would be salted and dried as much as they could, both for inland trade and for winter preservation. Root vegetables were also dearly important to people because they were one of the few kinds of vegetables that could withstand poor soils and still last through the winter. One of these vegetables was the iconic carrot, and here's an interesting fact. In medieval times, you actually had purple and yellow carrots instead of orange. We're going to start our list off with cabbage and potato hash. Honestly, it doesn't get more economical than this either, so it's a fantastic place to start. Let me tell you a little something about cabbages and potatoes before we begin dissecting this dish. So, back in the days before modern refrigeration became such a nationally accepted miracle, people actually used to worry a lot about the seasonal nature of ingredients, fruits, and vegetables. Cabbage and potatoes were arguably the sole exception to this because they can be grown and cooked pretty much throughout the entire season. Now, this was also a dish that took barely any oil or lard, and also didn't really require any kind of cooking utensils, skills, or experience. It's one of the most ideal dinners because potatoes and cabbage are always available for dirt cheap in markets, and you can make an infinite amount of combinations through them. Though some people really don't like their cabbage, something about the texture. Which side of the boat do you find yourself leaning towards? Are cabbage and potato hash something you'd try if your wallet was in bad enough shape? Or would you have a taste anyway just to see? Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles, and maple syrup. Side dishes were once as thoughtfully prepared as the main course, and few were as simple yet elegant as a well-roasted carrot medley. Coated in honey, butter, and a hint of cinnamon, this dish was a staple at homecoming dinners, adding a touch of natural sweetness to balance out heavier meats and casseroles. Carrots were a practical choice for home cooks. They were cheap, easy to store, and available year-round, making them a kitchen essential. Roasting them brought out their natural sugars, and when paired with honey and warm spices, they became more than just a side dish. They were a highlight. Some versions used maple syrup instead, while others incorporated fresh herbs for a more savory twist. No matter the variation, the result was always a vibrant, glossy medley of tender carrots with a flavor profile that felt both nostalgic and indulgent. As processed vegetable sides and microwave steamed bags took over grocery store shelves, many home cooks stopped roasting vegetables altogether. Instead of taking the time to caramelize their natural flavors, people opted for pre-cut and pre-cooked options. Rabbit stew is pretty self-explanatory. It's, well, rabbit stew, you know? I'm just kidding. It was a lot different from the stews we might be used to seeing today or even 50 to 60 years ago. Hunting wild game such as rabbits was how people lived off of the land, and making these stews would ensure enough food to last the day and give everyone 2 or 3 square meals. What people would do is add as many herbs, aromatics, and vegetables as they could. They took a very different approach to cooking. Some of these spices, like cumin or black pepper powder, may not necessarily have gone the best with rabbit stew. They were still added for any perceived medicinal benefits, though, like digestion and gut health. Back then, people were so used to eating whatever was available or whatever would keep them full longer. If it would taste good, that would be even better, but something tasting good was never a priority. Hunting rabbits was something everyone, from kids to adults, would be involved in, and villages and communities would set out traps for miles to capture as much game as they could. One of the next inventive things people came up with during really hard times was potato peel soup. This is about as bare bones as it sounds because it's really just seasoned water that's been made into a makeshift broth with potato peels in there. Despite this, let me tell you a little about why this is a pretty good dish. It's because it keeps you full for an incredible amount of time. Have you ever had oatmeal and felt incredibly full afterward? For like a surprisingly long amount of time? This is because oatmeal has a substantial amount of fiber in it, and potatoes are pretty much the same. Half their fiber content comes from the peel itself, actually. This is what makes potato peel soup such a good dish for when you don't really have any kind of money. It sustains you and really helps keep your appetite down, which is sad in retrospect because you have to be keeping your hunger down, but these days we have to do that pretty often. It helps to have dishes that are really good with fiber because they have this nice effect of you wanting less food, and thus you have more money at the end of the day. Bright, tangy, and effortlessly elegant lemon chicken piccata was once a dinner table favorite. With its delicate balance of citrus, butter, and briny capers, this dish turned simple ingredients into something refined. Italian-American families popularized it in mid-century kitchens, and by the 1960s, it had become a go-to recipe for home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to a weeknight meal. Chicken was an economical protein, but before boneless, skinless cuts were widely available, whole birds had to be broken down by hand. Piccata was traditionally made with thinly pounded chicken breasts, quickly dredged in flour and sauteed until golden. The sauce was the star. Fresh lemon juice and capers combined with a silky butter reduction to create a dish that was light yet deeply flavorful. It was often served with pasta or rice, making it both practical and satisfying. So why did this dish vanish from home kitchens? Over time, complex flavors gave way to simpler, more standardized meals. The rise of processed sauces and pre-made chicken dishes made from scratch piccata seemed like more effort than it was worth. Salted fish and porridge is an example of an essential combination in medieval times. It was especially popular in coastal and northern regions. This is because preservation was a massive deal in those areas due to how they were always just dealing with rougher, colder climates. Also, it might be surprising, but fish was a religious pillar for people. The Catholic Church back then was the reigning religious authority, and it would impose all kinds of fast days, especially every Friday. See, here, any kind of meat was forbidden, except fish. The logic behind this is that the practice of fasting during Lent and on Fridays is to abstain from fleshly meat, but since fish are cold-blooded, they don't come into flesh meat. It's a technical exception. The porridge itself was something that would contrast very well with the fermented taste of the fish, and in some households, people were adding herbs, onions, and garlic as well. This was a dish that was always eaten out of necessity. Almond milk porridge was a very common dish throughout the medieval times. It was something two groups of people would use very regularly. One, it's something you would always see in a wealthy person's pantry. Almond milk was seen as a luxurious kind of milk, and the cost of almonds was high. Second, it was common amongst Catholic citizens who were fasting on Fridays. Animal-related products would often be banned during fasts, but almond milk was just plant-based. It was a lot more typical to see it in monastic kitchens and in cities rather than anywhere outside of that. The porridge would be made by simmering the grains until they were soft and thick, and then almond milk would be added in and stirred so that the dish could become smoother and more rich. People back then would grind blanched almonds into pastes and then steep them in water. They'd strain the mixture through a cloth to produce the liquid, and the leftover pulp was something people would use in cakes and other desserts or for more porridge later on. It was a pretty comforting and refreshing dish. Boiled salt pork and beans are pretty much the same deal. Now, beans just happen to be man's best friend when the going gets rough. You have so many different kinds of them, and you can have twice as many different kinds of food with them. Stews, soups, or something as economical as this. Boiled salt pork and beans actually stems from the Depression era, and it was a way to stretch out meat rations when they were running low, which was usually always. This is more beans than pork, I'll admit, but either way, it's a protein power punch that you don't want to be missing from your diet. Boiled salt pork and beans are also some of the easiest kinds of plates of food you can make. You don't really need to do anything besides just take the salt pork and boil it, along with the beans, adding whatever seasonings, aromatics, and herbs you prefer. That's pretty much how a lot of people used it back then anyway, although we have the benefit of choosing much better cuts of meat than they did. Even with a dish like this, in the Depression era, people would essentially just wait until the butcher's shops were discarding their most unwanted parts of the animal, and that's what they would buy for as cheap of a price as they could bargain for. It was usually something most shops were happy to let go of for some chump change, but nowadays, even that's like half your rent. Once a staple of working-class kitchens, this hearty one-dish meal was built on the kind of ingredients that stretched a family's budget without sacrificing flavor. Cabbage, potatoes, and smoked sausage, three of the most economical and widely available foods, came together in layers, baked slowly in a rich mustard cream sauce. The result was a rustic, deeply satisfying dish that filled bellies and kept families warm through colder months. Cabbage was a practical ingredient, valued for its long shelf life and versatility. When paired with smoky seasoned sausage and starchy potatoes, it created a meal that was both inexpensive and packed with flavor. The mustard-infused cream sauce added a tangy richness, tying everything together. Some home cooks added a dash of vinegar for brightness, while others incorporated cheese for extra indulgence. No matter the variation, this dish was proof that humble ingredients could create something truly special. Why did it fall out of favor? The rise of prepackaged meals and low-carb trends made cabbage-heavy dishes less common, and as quick stovetop meals replaced slow-baked casseroles, this once popular dish faded from view. The word mazeln actually ends up coming from mestillon in Old French, which means to mix, and that's exactly what mazelon bread is. If you wanted an idea of what a medieval mixed loaf would look like, then look no further. It was very common to see this in England, France, and the Low Countries, especially between 1000 to 1500 years. Mazelon was one of the most common kinds of bread for a specific reason, and this is actually because the climate was decently different in medieval times. Wheat was something that was born in more humid climates, so it struggled in northern and upland areas. Rye was a lot more reliable, on the other hand. It was known for also producing a darker bread that would keep you full for longer. People would get whatever wheat they had, mix it with rye, and get this loaf that was dense from rye but fluffy and soft from the wheat. It was a very interesting kind of loaf, really. And while we have several mixed grain breads in today's time, this was one of the easiest ways to spice up your daily routine back then. There was a time when Sunday dinner wasn't complete without a plate of slow-cooked, gravy-drenched pork chops. Smothered in rich, savory onion gravy and served alongside a heaping portion of mashed potatoes, this dish was a cornerstone of Southern home cooking. It was an experience, one that filled the kitchen with the unmistakable aroma of comfort. Pork was an affordable alternative to beef, making it a practical choice for families looking to stretch their grocery budget. Bone-in chops were particularly popular, as they were both flavorful and inexpensive. The slow cooking process allowed even the toughest cuts to become fork tender, absorbing the deep, savory notes of the seasoned gravy. Some cooks swore by a cast-iron skillet, while others let the dish simmer in a slow cooker for hours, ensuring the pork melted in your mouth. But as convenience foods and boneless, skinless meats took over the supermarket, this dish began to disappear. Quick-fix dinners replaced slow-simmered meals, and thick homemade gravies gave way to powdered mixes and canned alternatives. Today, smothered pork chops are a rare sight at the dinner table, but for those who remember the first bite of a perfectly tender chop covered in rich, peppery gravy, it's a dish worth revisiting. Baked apples with honey were such an incredible medieval dish that they were especially for any kind of party or celebration. The baking was always done near the fire or a hearth oven, and the dish was incredibly simple. It really was just an apple that was baked whole with honey drizzled over it, or sometimes they would simply dip the whole thing in honey. People would also boil the apples first and then bake them to get a dish that resembled the texture of apple pudding as we know it today. This dish was eaten at the end of a course or as a fast day meal, and honey and apples were things that you could eat on days where you had to fast. The combination of a softened, decadent apple mixed in with caramelized golden honey was something that scratched all the right itches. Baked apples with honey had an incredibly strong association with festive and seasonal meals, and they were particularly really popular around harvest and Christmas. Apples were abundant, and honey was something that people could spare sometimes for the right kind of occasion. This dish is something you see in medical texts, estate records, cookbooks, and other medieval-era references. Apples were also prized because of how easy they were to store. Mock-fried chicken steak is a really interesting one because this actually makes use of so many things in creative ways to mimic the texture, taste, and overall feeling of fried chicken steak. Traditionally, the recipe calls for cheap cuts of meat, but in the Great Depression, people were even running with non-meat ingredients thanks to World War II rationing, which really put a massive hole in America's overall meat supply. In the 50s, too, home cooks brought this recipe back when they really needed to stretch a small amount of protein or use government food. So if you make this dish with ground meat or beef pork and shape it into a patty, mix it with breadcrumbs and cracker crumbs, and then douse it in seasoned flour or cracker crumbs again, then pan-fry it, you get a pretty decent imitation of chicken fried steak. You just have to be really careful with what kind of seasonings you use because it's also true that the kind of seasoning you go with decides how good of an imitation of a chicken fried steak this is. The most interesting part is probably the flour-based version, which was straight out of the Depression. People would make a fritter using flour, milk, and eggs to make something that resembled a steak, and this was seasoned and fried. There was no meat, but it was meant to imitate the breading, flour-y taste of the meal anyway. In all cases, it was a comfort meat, and a chunk of that comfort was that it kept your wallet in good health. For generations, baked cod was a dependable, no-fuss dinner, particularly in coastal and New England households. Light, flaky, and mild in flavor, cod was one of the most affordable fish available, making it a practical choice for families looking to put a nutritious meal on the table without overspending. Topped with a crisp breadcrumb and herb crust, this dish was both simple and satisfying. Proof that great cooking didn't need to be complicated. Cod's popularity was tied to its abundance. Throughout much of the 20th century, fresh or frozen cod was readily available at grocery stores and fish markets, and it didn't require elaborate preparation. A coating of breadcrumbs, butter, and fresh herbs locked in moisture while creating a crunchy, golden brown topping. Baked rather than fried, this dish had a lighter texture, making it a favorite among those who wanted something hearty without being heavy. So why did it disappear? Overfishing led to shortages, making cod more expensive, and as frozen fish sticks and pre-breaded fillies flooded supermarkets, many home cooks stopped preparing fish from scratch. Dandelion and bacon grease salad is an example of how Depression-era and 20th century foraging can actually lead to some really innovative recipes. This is something that's rooted in rural Midwestern culture, and this salad makes use of whatever is available in the wilds that day. One of the most common things you would ever find in these wilds was dandelion greens. They grew wild in all kinds of environments, roadsides, fields, and yards, and they were a really prized thing for the people. Most folks believed it was a natural remedy for a lot of things because it was believed to help with things like indigestion, inflammation, and strengthening your immune system. In subsistence farming areas and coal country, it was very common for families to teach their kids how to forage dandelion greens. Remember how I told you about the way bacon grease is used in a lot of these dishes? Yeah, so after frying the bacon, a small amount of bacon grease would be preserved and it would be used to flavor any kind of bland or plain dish like beans and cornbread and give it a bit of a savory edge. The rendered fat was really helpful to people because it also meant they didn't exactly need that much oil. Onion tarts were naturally one of the go-to meals for people, given how important onions themselves were in times like these. But one has to ask, what really is an onion tart? A typical medieval tart would basically start with a coarse flour crust. This would be made from the typical rye, barley, and maslin mixes we've seen so far, and that's how the pastry was made. This would be a vessel for the filling, which would be made out of parboiled onions and butter. These softened onions would be mixed with herbs and then enriched more with eggs or fresh cheese, whichever was available, or both, if you were doing well. This mixture would then go into the shell of the tart, and it would then be baked until you would get a lightly brown surface. In southern Europe and the regions that are now France and Germany, this dish was the predecessor of dishes like onion pies in modern times. This was a pretty herbal-tasting dish that carried the flavor of onions over almost perfectly, and it was something people would rely on when they wanted an open-faced, savory treat. For decades, this dish was the definition of hearty, home-cooked comfort food. A cross between a hamburger and a meatloaf, Salisbury steak offered all the savory satisfaction of a beefy main course, without the expense of premium cuts. Smothered in a rich mushroom and onion gravy, it was often served alongside mashed potatoes, soaking up every last drop of its flavorful sauce. The origins of this dish date back to the late 19th century when Dr. James Salisbury, a physician, promoted chopped beef as a health food. But it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it became a household favorite, especially during the post-war years when ground beef was an affordable, versatile staple. Mixing the meat with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings helped stretch a family's grocery budget, making it a go-to recipe for filling, cost-effective meals. The cooking process was simple yet rewarding. The beef patties were seared to lock in flavor, then simmered slowly in a rich, savory gravy made from beef broth, onions, and mushrooms. The rise of frozen TV dinners turned Salisbury steak into a mass-produced meal, often losing the homemade taste that made it special. Hot cornbread is a historically significant variation of cornbread. Why? It's because it was so common in many disadvantaged communities in the South. Poor Black communities and even white communities in towns and rural outskirts from the 19th to the 20th century would try to get through the week just by lasting on this. As far as keeping it low-key is concerned, this minimalistic dish is definitely the way to go, and cornmeal, boiling water, and salt is all you need. It doesn't need eggs, milk, or wheat flour, it doesn't need any kind of oven, and it also doesn't really feel like a meal either. A small scoop of cornmeal was enough to make a lot of patties, yeah, but you needed a decent amount of sides to make sure it was actually a fulfilling dish, like beans, greens, and potatoes would help a lot. Also, in Black Southern communities, hot water cornbread was one of their core recipes, a real pillar of the community, and each different variation of cornbread was passed down from generation to generation, usually just by observation, word of mouth, or having someone drill the lesson into your head. There was a time when meatloaf was a household tradition. Made from simple, inexpensive ingredients, it was a staple of weeknight dinners and homecoming feasts alike, But what made this version special was the glaze, a perfectly balanced mix of ketchup and brown sugar that caramelized into a sticky, flavorful coating as it baked. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins, and by mixing it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, home cooks could stretch a single pound to feed an entire family. Some variations included oats or crushed crackers, while others relied on Worcestershire sauce and mustard for added depth. But the secret weapon was always the glaze, a blend of sweet and tangy flavors that sealed in moisture and gave the loaf its signature glossy finish. So why did this dish start disappearing from dinner tables? As dietary trends shifted, meatloaf's reputation took a hit. Low-carb diets, leaner meat choices, and a move away from home-cooked comfort foods made it less popular. Pre-made frozen meatloaves also contributed, offering convenience at the cost of homemade flavor. Which of these old dinners would you try? Tell us below, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten favorites.